The movie tells the story of a spaceship called Avalon that travels to a new habitable planet called Homestead 2. It carries 258 crew members and 5,000 passengers who have been in hibernation for 120 years. However, it suddenly passed through an asteroid belt and its protective coating eroded. Fuel was diverted to the main shield, but the plane stayed on course near the giant asteroid. The plane crashed into the asteroid and was damaged. The craft performed automatic repairs, but one of the hibernation tubes became activated. The passenger in the canister was Jim Preston, an engine technician. The canister opens and the system awakens Jim, informing him that he has spent 120 years in suspended animation and that his ship is only 4 months away from Homestead 2. The system tells Jim that he can pass the time by enjoying the luxurious facilities provided on board. Jim receives information about his ID bracelet, his cabin, and the activities he needs to do before arriving at the destination planet. Jim is excited and nervous about meeting the other people on board. Jim gets ready, then leaves his cabin and walks to the automated classroom designated for learning activities. Jim looks anxious as a holographic figure explains the situation on Earth, where Earth is now overcrowded, too expensive to live on, and no longer habitable. The figure tells Jim to postpone his questions until the end of the lesson, but Jim keeps asking. Why was he the only person there? He realizes that the hologram figure can't answer his questions, so he goes looking for someone else. He got to the main room of the plane, but there was no one there. There was only an automated information machine offering him help. Jim asked to speak to a real person, and the machine sent him to speak to a steward. But he found no one when he got to the corridor. Although he didn't have access to the crew quarters, he didn't see a single crew member awake. Jim finally went to the observatory, where he later learned that the plane was still 90 years from Homestead 2. He realized that he woke up too soon. He rushed back to the main room and sent a message to Earth, asking what he should do as he had no idea how to get back into hibernation mode. The information engine informed him that it would take about 55 years to get an answer from Earth. Jim is desperate. He walks around and finds a bar, where he sees another person. As he talks to the bartender, Jim feels strange about this bartender. When he goes to get him a drink, Jim realizes that the bartender is an android robot. This robot is named Arthur. Jim wanted to get more information from Arthur, but he couldn't even explain why he could wake up faster than everyone else. Jim wakes up in his cabin the next day and goes to the cafeteria, where he quickly realizes that most of the menu is reserved for first-class passengers. He got his usual coffee and tried to figure out how to repair his hibernation tube. After he got all the tools he needed, he attempted to fiddle with his hibernation tube and lay down inside the tube, but his efforts were unsuccessful. Jim decided to use the tools he found to break into the crew's hibernation chamber, but again his efforts were unsuccessful. Minor damage occurred around the plane. Jim returns daily to the bar for a drink, but his main goal is to talk to Arthur. Arthur came up with the idea of going into the first-class facilities and trying to have some fun there. Jim tried all the facilities in the restaurants, games, and entertainment, but as time went on, he became more and more sad about being there alone. One day he got drunk and wandered around the hibernation tube. When he accidentally walked into a room, he found an astronaut suit. Jim tried it on, then entered the vacuum chamber. He pushes the lever, then presses the button to open the door. Once outside the craft, he was mesmerized by what he saw. He was the only lucky person to have experienced the event. Jim removed the magnets from his boots and floated through space. He went back inside, took off the astronaut suit, then returned to the vacuum of space without it on. He pulls a lever, preparing to end his life. But then he changes his mind and runs back to the plane and he trips over a bottle. Jim stands up and is instantly attracted to a woman in one of the tubes named Aurora Lane. He searches for Aurora's file and listens to her interview. He becomes enamored. Later, he sits next to Aurora's tube while listening to her interview. Back at the bar, he reads some of Aurora's work and talks about it with Arthur. He then laments his ironic life, intending to go to another planet for a better life, but he wakes up early and never makes it there, then finding the perfect woman for him. But he could never be with her. Jim keeps thinking about it and starts to come up with ideas to wake Aurora up. Jim discusses it with Arthur, but Arthur doesn't understand what he's explaining. If Jim woke Aurora up for his own benefit, It would mean that Aurora would spend the rest of her life with Jim and would die on the plane. Jim decided against it, but he couldn't get the idea out of his mind. Until one day he changed his mind. He went to Aurora's tube and managed to wake her up. As Aurora woke up and went through a series of processes, Jim hid and returned to his room. Moments later, Jim goes to the main room, hoping to find Aurora. Aurora is there, looking confused, just like Jim did a year ago. Jim tells her that only the two of them are awake. Then, Jim takes her to the observatory. Later, Jim says that he didn't find the crew or the captain. Aurora is terrified and wants to go back to her tube. When they got to the cabin, Jim explained that there was no special equipment on board that could help them return to hibernation mode. Or in other words, they were both stranded on the plane. They returned to the main room, and Aurora said that she wanted to rest because she had just woken up from hibernation. Jim is disappointed and feels sorry for what he has done. Jim asks Arthur not to tell Aurora that Jim woke her up. The next day, Aurora woke up from her sleep. She goes to the main room and asks the information machine about the hibernation tube. Jim approaches Aurora and they both go to the cafeteria for breakfast. As they walk, the information machine malfunctions. In the cafeteria, Aurora realizes that Jim has been eating the same food for over a year and gives him a first-class meal. They talk about the possibility of repairing the tube. Unlike Jim, Aurora still wanted to try. She searches for tools in the repair room, then goes through research documents, and finally attempts to break down the door of the crew hibernation room. Jim realized there was more damage to the ship. Aurora laments that her life must be spent on Avalon. She writes, jogs, and swims at the facility, and begins to accept reality. She goes to the cafeteria to interview Jim, thinking he might provide interesting inspiration for her writing. Aurora asks Jim why he wants to move to a new planet. Jim replies that he wants to be a better person and start a new life. Later, they end up at the observatory, and Aurora finally explains why she's there. Unlike the other passengers on the plane, Aurora has a round-trip ticket. Her plan is to go to Homestead 2, stay there for a year, then return to Earth to become the first journalist to ever do so, and write the greatest stories in history. Aurora slowly gives up on finding a way to make things right. Jim finds ways to cheer her up by taking her dancing, to the movies, and to basketball. Jim also takes her to a bar to meet Arthur. Aurora felt calm for a while. However, she became anxious again. Jim then feels bad about what he has done to Aurora. Later, Jim makes something. In another moment, Aurora walks into the observatory and finds the miniature Chrysler building that Jim made for her. Sometime later, they have a date at the bar. They have dinner and share stories about their lives. Aurora tells him that her father died when she was a teenager. After dinner, Jim takes Aurora to a vacuum chamber and they put on astronaut suits. They go into space together. Jim finally has someone to share the incredible experience with. Jim turns off the magnets in their boots and they float in space together. They go back inside the plane and kiss. They move to Jim's cabin and sleep together. In the days that follow, they begin to live as lovers. Aurora now lives in Jim's cabin and starts writing about her life on the plane. Jim explores the plane further and discovers a hydroponics room. Jim brings flowers to Aurora. One day, the plane passes a large red star and they go to the observatory to see it. It was Aurora's birthday that day, so they celebrated at a restaurant. Jim went to the restroom and prepared the ring he had made for Aurora. Meanwhile, Aurora stays at the bar, chatting with Arthur. Arthur tells Aurora that Jim woke her up on purpose, not realizing that it was still a secret. Suddenly, Jim returns and can't believe what he sees. Aurora runs off in anger and panic. Jim returns to his cabin, finding all of Aurora's things no longer there. They meet in the cafeteria the next day, but when Jim speaks, Aurora shies away. Aurora was desperate. One night, she goes to Jim's cabin, punches and kicks him, and wants to kill him. Jim tried to talk to Aurora through the communication machine. Jim apologizes and explains the reason for what he did to Aurora. Jim said that he was in love with Aurora, but Aurora didn't care. She couldn't forgive Jim for taking her life. One night, while Jim was in his cabin, another malfunction occurred. The plane was badly damaged and the main command was shut down. Later, he got into the elevator, but it didn't work. Aurora walks into the main room and sees that Jim has planted a tree there. Then she went to the cafeteria and found out that the food supply machine had also malfunctioned. Suddenly, the two hear the captain's voice asking who planted the tree. They both ran to the main room and saw Gus Mancuso standing in front of the tree. They introduced themselves and explained the situation. Gus didn't understand why the 3 tubes were damaged. Gus took them to the corridor and discovered that something was wrong with the airplane, and knew that the information system had to be checked manually. As they leave the corridor, the robot almost falls on their heads, and they both tell Gus that the malfunctions are becoming more frequent on the plane. Gus says it shouldn't be happening. Gus shows them how to collect data. Gus is checking the hibernation tubes. He knows what happened to the Aurora tube. Gus thinks what Jim did was a crime. Gus is in the corridor checking the available data when Aurora approaches him. They talk about what happened to Aurora's tubes. He says that he can't do anything about it. Jim then enters with the damaged 16th robot. Gus feels sick. Then he goes to rest, but as he walks out, he coughs up blood. That night, Aurora can't sleep, so she goes swimming. Suddenly, the ship lost gravity, and she got entangled in the water. The gravity control machine returned to normal, and Aurora survived. They both agreed to look for Gus. The 3 of them returned to the corridor, slowly finding clues about what happened to the plane. Gus learned that the accident 2 years ago had damaged the main systems. They need to find and fix the cause of the damage, as the entire plane will be affected. They go to find the problem, but Gus faints. So Jim and Aurora take him to the clinic. He was seriously ill, and no amount of treatment could cure him. Sometime later, the 3 of them meet at the observatory. Gus gives Jim his identity bracelet and asks them to fix the plane. Later, Gus passed away. Suddenly, the lights turn red, which is a sign of danger, and the plane starts shaking. Jim tells Aurora that he needs her help and they run. However, there is another gravity malfunction. Finally, Arthur has a malfunction as well. Jim disables him. They finally arrive at the engine room and start looking for the problem. As it turns out, the problem is in the power plant. When they opened a door, Aurora was sucked in. The asteroid has caused damage to that part of the plane. Jim is sucked in too, but he holds onto the door and keeps trying to close it. Eventually, he was sucked in too, but they quickly managed to close the gap. Soon after repairing the damage, Jim realized that there was more than one damage to the hull. They discovered that the meteor had hit the reactor's control computer. Jim thought he could find spare parts to fix it. They found the parts and fixed it, but they couldn't cool the reactor. They do it manually, but it still fails. Jim learns that he needs to open the ventilation door from outside the plane so they can cool the reactor. The 2 go to the vacuum chamber, and as Jim gets ready to exit, he gives Gus's ID bracelet to Aurora, as he may not be coming back. Aurora helps Jim put on the astronaut suit, and as he walks to the vacuum, Aurora asks him to come back, as she can't live on the plane without Jim. Aurora returns to the reactor room, where the temperature has reached a critical height. A bolt from the reactor bounces off Aurora's arm. Jim moves closer to the vent and sees a door. The temperature in the reactor room continues to rise. As he tries to get to the vent door and open it, he quickly realizes that he will have to manually hold the door open for the reactor to cool down, and he tells Aurora about the plan. Aurora doesn't like the plan, but Jim goes ahead anyway and asks Aurora to help him. Aurora doesn't want Jim to die, but they know they have to save the other people on the plane, and Aurora finally agrees. Their plan works, but smoke from the reactor sends Jim bouncing away and his mooring breaks. The pressure inside his astronaut suit also drops. Jim tells Aurora what happened, and Aurora moves as fast as she can to put on her astronaut suit and save him. Jim apologizes to Aurora again. Aurora puts on the astronaut suit and flies out to save Jim, but her mooring rope is too short. She is pulled back, but suddenly she manages to grab Jim's mooring and manages to pull him into the plane. Aurora drags Jim to the clinic and finds that Jim is dead. She then uses Gus's bracelet to break medical protocol and attempts to shock Jim with electricity. The medical tube works and eventually revives Jim. Aurora forgives him. Later, Aurora fixes Arthur, and they make a ceremony for Gus. Jim says that he has found a way to use the medical tube as a hibernation chamber. He asks Aurora to get into the tube and continue the journey as per her ideals, but Aurora refuses and decides to stay with Jim on the plane. Jim eventually proposed to her and they lived out their lives on the spaceship. 88 years later, The Avalon arrived at Homestead 2. The crew wakes up and finds the plane in a very unexpected state. Aurora leaves them a message, retelling the story of her and Jim's life on the plane, while the rest are sleeping, and the movie ends. If you like this video, don't forget to subscribe. Because by subscribing you have supported me to make better videos. See you in the next video.